My name is Mary. I can still hear the sound of their laughter. It wasn't just laughter. It was that sharp, cutting, belly-deep kind of laugh that makes you feel like the entire world is in on the joke except you. I sat at that dinner table, trying to swallow the sting, but every chuckle felt like another knife in my chest. My husband, my own husband, the man who vowed to love and protect me, was the ringleader. And what was the punchline? My body, my weight, my so-called failure to fit the image of the perfect slim wife he wanted to parade in front of his family. He leaned back in his chair with a smug smile and said, in front of everyone, maybe I should have married a slim girl, someone who's actually my type. And just like that, the room erupted. His mother snickered behind her napkin. His brother laughed so hard he nearly choked on his food. Even his father, a man who barely spoke 2 sentences at any gathering, couldn't hold back a chuckle. And me? I sat there frozen, cheeks burning, feeling smaller and heavier at the same time, like I was being crushed under the weight humiliation. You ever have one of those moments where the world slows down and you suddenly realize you're the target of everyone's entertainment? I had been made into a spectacle, a joke, and no one, not one single person, spoke up to defend me. Not even him. Especially not him. I excused myself after that dinner. I don't think anyone even noticed the way my eyes glossed over or the tremble in my voice when I mumbled something about needing the restroom. No one cared. They were still laughing when I slipped out of the room, my ears ringing with shame. I remember gripping the edge of the bathroom sink, staring into the mirror, and for the first time in years, I didn't even recognize the woman looking back. My mascara was smudged, my face blotchy from trying to hold in tears, and all I could think was, is this really my life? See, what you need to understand is that this wasn't just one cruel joke. This wasn't an isolated moment. This was the tip of a very large, very ugly iceberg. For years, my husband had been chipping away at me, piece by piece, subtle jabs at first, wrapped in the disguise of humor. Oh, you're really going for seconds? Maybe stick to salad this time. You'd look so cute if you lost 10 pounds. Always followed by that smirk in a casual, I'm just teasing, babe, don't be so sensitive. But those teases add up. They dig into your bones, settle in your chest, and start to rewrite the way you see yourself. He made me believe that maybe I wasn't good enough, that maybe he was settling by being with me. And the worst part? His family mirrored his behavior. It was like cruelty was their family tradition, and I was the designated outsider, the chosen target. And yet, I stayed. I stayed because I loved him, or at least I loved the version of him I met before the mask slipped. The man who brought me flowers on our first date, who used to listen when I talked about my dreams, who held me when my father passed away. I clung to that memory, hoping it would come back, convincing myself that if I just lost a little weight, if I just tried harder, maybe he'd love me the way he used to. But that night at the dinner table, something shifted. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was betrayal. You know how they say sometimes a single moment can change everything? That was mine. It was like a switch flipped inside me. The shame was still there, but underneath it, something darker began to stir. Because here's the thing. I wasn't as weak as they thought I was. I wasn't blind, and I wasn't helpless. I had been quiet, yes, patient, but I had also been paying attention. Every insult, every smirk, every degrading word, I remembered. I remembered everything. And while they laughed at me, what they didn't know was that I was already laying the foundation of something far greater than their cruel little jokes. Revenge. Now, before you judge me, let me ask you this. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have smiled and swallowed it, pretending like it didn't cut you open from the inside out? Would you have let your partner belittle you in front of his family, the very people who are supposed to welcome you with open arms? Or would you have done what I did? Take that pain, that humiliation, and turn it into fuel for something much, much bigger. Because I'll be honest, I didn't decide on revenge overnight. It took time. At first, I just wanted to disappear. I thought about packing a bag, walking out the door, never looking back. But then I realized leaving would give him exactly what he wanted: freedom, an easy exit, a chance to replace me with the slim little trophy wife he clearly fantasized about. No, that would have been too kind. I wanted him to hurt. I wanted him to feel the same sting, the same humiliation, the same gut-wrenching shame that he so casually threw at me. And not just him, his whole family. The ones who sat there and laughed as if my pain was a comedy show put on for their amusement. That night, when I crawled into bed next to him, pretending to be asleep, I stared at the ceiling and began to plan. Slowly, carefully, meticulously. Revenge isn't something you rush. It's something you craft, like a masterpiece. And oh, I was going to make mine unforgettable. But before I get into how it all went down, you need to understand just how deep this wound went. You need to know why I couldn't just let it slide, why I couldn't just move on like some people might suggest. Because when you spend years being told you're not good enough, when the one person who's supposed to be your safe place turns into your worst critic, something inside you breaks. And once it breaks, there's no gluing it back together. I remember lying awake at night, replaying that dinner scene in my head, every laugh echoing in my skull. My husband's smirk burned into my memory. The way his brother slapped the table, wheezing from laughter. The way his mother tilted her head and gave me that pitying look, like I was some sad little creature she couldn't wait for her son to replace. And the more I replayed it, the angrier I got. Anger has a way of transforming you, doesn't it? It sharpens your mind, clears the fog, and for the first time in years, I saw things with absolute clarity. This wasn't just about my body. This was about respect. Or rather, the complete lack of it. So, I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I wasn't going to beg for his affection or his validation. Instead, I was going to take every ounce of pain he gave me, and I was going to hand it back to him tenfold. And let me tell you something. When a woman who's been underestimated decides to fight back, that's when the real story begins. The next morning, the house looked the same. The same chipped mug on the counter, the same crooked picture in the hallway, the same sunlight sliding across the floorboards. And yet, everything felt irreparably different. I went about my routine, like a ghost on autopilot, poured coffee, scrolled my phone, smiled in a practiced way when he kissed my cheek goodbye. He hummed something under his breath, oblivious or pretending to be. That was the thing about him. He could always act like nothing happened. That calm, that dismissive ease, that was another jab. It was as if he expected me to forget the whole thing, like it was nothing more than a bad joke. I did not forget. I could not. So I began, quietly. The way you start a fire under a cold, stagnant place, with patience and careful attention to oxygen. Revenge, I decided, wasn't about blowing everything up at once. That's what movies make you believe. Real revenge is slow. It's an accumulation of small, surgical strikes that, when combined, leave the other person unrecognizable. I needed to be methodical because I didn't want to be reckless. Reckless makes noise. Noise attracts attention. Attention leads to mistakes. First, intelligence. You don't attack without knowing what you're attacking. That would be foolish. I started with the obvious. His friends, his siblings, his habits, his secrets. I listened more than I spoke. I read his messages when he left his phone face down on the kitchen table. I watched how he tucked his shirt into his trousers before going to work, how he checked his reflection, not for himself, but to see how others saw him. It's ridiculous when you think about it. I'd spent years sharing a life with this man, and yet there were whole rooms of his life I'd never entered until now. They were corners lined with arrogance and entitlement that I never paid attention to because I was too busy trying to be the better half he wanted. And then I made a list. I know that sounds cold. Lists are clinical and emotions are messy, but lists are clarity. They turn feelings into steps. On the top of the list was humiliation. If he could humiliate me so publicly, then I would create a public reckoning. But not scandalous, not slanderous. I'm not into breaking the law or turning into the very thing he is. I wanted justice. I wanted him to see himself the way he made me feel. Step 1 of my plan involved reclaiming my image. For years, I had hidden, avoided mirrors, made excuses not to take photos, let the camera in our house collect dust. He and his family treated me like a disappointing exhibit, so I would become an exhibit of my own making. Polished, confident, inscrutable. I started small, new lipstick, a haircut that framed my face instead of hiding it, a wardrobe that didn't scream for approval but whispered it. Clothes that fit, not to please anyone, but because I had the right to take up space. I spent hours watching videos about posture, the way certain fabrics moved, the language of eyes. I practiced walking through our front room with my head held high just for myself. It was satisfying in the small, electric way of someone reacquainting themselves with their own body. While I was reinventing my exterior, I worked on other things too. A little financial leverage, a few social seeds planted. You'd be surprised how much power comes from subtle independence. I dusted off the online freelancing profiles I had abandoned years ago. I reconnected with a client who needed copy for a website redesign. The gigs were small at first, but they added up. Money in my name, not his. Autonomy built slowly like a wall of bricks around my heart. But the real art of revenge required allies. You can do a lot alone, but exile a bully with witnesses, and the effect is multiplied. I thought about who he actually respected. Who in his circle was the barometer of his ego? I knew his younger sister still lived under the impression that he was golden, flawless. I knew his college buddy, the one with the loud laugh who used to drive a convertible and now drove a better car, cared more about status than morals. I also knew his work environment, a glossy office with corporate smiles and weekend golf trips, people who loved gossip because it was cleaner than introspection. I began to plant seeds among his acquaintances without appearing to do anything at all. Casual mentions to the right people about how I'd started a small consulting project, how I'd taken up photography as a serious side hustle, how I'd been learning to manage social media for small brands. Little boasts, framed as humble updates that quietly suggested I was more than the fat wife they mocked. I asked his ex-colleague about a networking event. I ran into his cousin at a supermarket and with the most nonchalant smile mentioned a party I'd be attending. Never direct, never suspicious. The way you water a plant at the perimeter and watch it grow in places you didn't expect. Of course, there were obstacles. He was not stupid. He had the kind of charm that disarmed questions and rewrote narratives on the fly. He would throw out a joke, and then with an easy grin, change the subject if anyone looked uncomfortable. There were nights I wanted to confront him, to scream until my voice went hoarse and his smugness crumbled into something real. But then my list would flash in my head. Patience. And I would bite my lip until it tasted of iron. There were close calls, too. Once, while he was on the phone in the other room, I opened his email by accident. I shouldn't have, I know, but curiosity is a powerful thief of rules. In a thread between him and his brother, I found a message that was like gasoline. Talk of a summer wedding, offhand comments about making sure the groom looks right, and a photo with a caption that made my skin crawl. Imagine replacing her with someone slim and elegant. That message could have broken me in an instant. Instead, it became fuel. I took a screenshot, but I didn't use it. Not yet. Data without timing is noise. I tucked it away like a loaded card to be played when the stakes demanded it. And then there was the moment when his mother called me dear with such condescension I could have spat fire. "You're trying so hard, aren't you?" she said, her voice syrupy. "For him." I smiled and said, "Yes, of course," and later lay awake thinking about how her approval had nothing to do with me and everything to do with my failure to be the version of woman she wanted. I remembered the look of relief on her face the night she watched her son make that public joke, like a burden had been lifted off the family. That relief would be one of the targets. As I moved through these social maneuvers, I also had to manage the boring, practical side of deception. If you're going to change the narrative about someone, you have to be impeccable about details. I started to show up at events wearing more confident versions of myself. I arrived early to places where I knew his friends would be and made first impressions that stuck. I learned the art of the perfect anecdote. Brief, clever, relatable. People remember stories, and I began to craft my own history in their minds. It wasn't lying. It was reclaiming the story that had been told about me. But make no mistake, the plan wasn't only social. There were tactical moves, too. I knew his weakness for status. He liked to be seen at the right places, to be photographed with the right people. So I began to create opportunities to make those moments crumble. I befriended the right photographer online, someone who had a reputation for being honest and a little ruthless with image curation. I befriended event planners who were always scouting for interesting guests. Quietly, I suggested him as a figure for their events. Not maliciously, but with the perfect level of flattering spin that would entice him. I wanted him to be visible in all the places he prized, and then I wanted the cracks to show. There was also the question of truth. You can orchestrate situations forever, but if nobody believed you, nothing changes. That's why gathering proof, not because I wanted to publicly shame him with salacious details, but because truth changes the angle of a story, became crucial. I compiled messages, saved photos, got witnesses to the small violences he performed in private. It turns out people remember kindnesses more than cruelties until someone points them out. Then the cruelty stands naked in the light. I set about creating a narrative that others could see and agree with. People don't change their minds because you tell them to. They change when the evidence sits in front of them like a photograph. As days turned into weeks, I felt the first small tremors of change. Conversations shifted. A colleague who had once laughed at his jokes now paused when I told a story about a project I'd completed. His friends, the ones who lived for gossip, began to check their phones when I walked into a room the way people check the scoreboard at a big game. Sometimes I'd see him watching me from across the room, that slight furrow in his brow, and I'd wonder if he sensed the slow collapse of the world he'd built around his ego. Still, there were nights I would catch myself crying into my pillow, the hurt less sharp but more insistent. Revenge does not erase pain. It reframes it. I would lie awake imagining the perfect confrontation, the moment he would finally understand what he'd done. But part of the plan was to deny him that immediate satisfaction. The payoff needed to be larger than a single scene. I wanted humiliation to mirror his, public, slow, and unforgettable. And yet, I had to be careful. The more I pushed, the more I risked exposure. There were times I almost slipped. Once, at a family brunch, His brother made a cruel aside about my eating habits. For a second, I felt rage lift like a tide, the urge to retort loud and sharp. But I kept my voice steady and laid a trap instead. I laughed, and then, in that low, controlled voice that makes people lean in, I said, I actually train others on body positivity. It's interesting how perspective changes when you're the one being judged. The remark hung there like a mirror, and the room went awkward. His brother sputtered. The joke didn't land the way they expected. That small moment was a victory. Not because I humiliated him outright, but because I disrupted the expected power dynamic. It was proof that the balance could be tipped. What would you have done in my place? Walked away, called him out in the heat of the moment, sued for defamation? I wanted you to think about that because in some twist of fate, the line between vindication and destruction is a thin one. I chose vindication because I wanted him to feel the truth in his bones, and the world to see the person he truly was. I wanted the shame, but not the cruelty. I wanted justice, but not to become like him. By the time the second month rolled around, my plan had more layers than I could have imagined. There were the social maneuvers, the financial independence, the alliances, the image overhaul, and the quiet compiling of evidence. Each move made him slightly less confident, slightly more cautious, and that's exactly where I wanted him. Confidence can carry arrogance, and arrogance makes careless mistakes. My aim was to be the nudge that sent him off balance. The first real break in his armor came innocuously. At a local charity gala, one he'd insisted we attend because it's good for image, I arrived wearing the dress I'd bought after that haircut. It fit like it had been waiting for me. People noticed. He noticed. He tried the old jokes, the thinly veiled compliments, the little digs dressed up as banter. But the room no longer rewarded him. Conversations turned to me, to a project I'd been quietly running that had made a ripple in a small but influential community. A respected woman in a nearby conversation asked me, with genuine interest, about my work. He lingered, flustered, not used to being sidelined. Later that night, I found his expression in the mirror, a flicker of something that wasn't amusement. Maybe it was panic. Maybe it was calculation. Whatever it was, it confirmed for me that momentum had shifted. The first stone had been dislodged. I won't lie and say I felt instant relief. It was intoxicating, yes, but also terrifying. There was a fine line between playing the long game and losing your soul to it. I reminded myself nightly why I started, not to destroy for sport, but to reclaim myself. The plan was working, but the goal always remained the same: restore my dignity, make him accountable, and make certain the people who once laughed would have to look at their actions in the cold light of day. At the end of that month, as I sat with my laptop and the list I'd made, I added a new item: patience again, because the next phase would require even more delicacy. The pieces were in place, the witnesses were watching, and now it was time to turn up the heat just enough to make the house of cards wobble without collapsing into chaos. The truth, when arranged properly, has its own momentum. All I needed was the right moment to set it loose. And if you're still with me, if you're wondering whether the slow burn was worth it, wait. Because what came next was the part where I could either finally step into the light or stumble into the very darkness I was trying to escape. I saw him the next morning at breakfast, his face betraying nothing. But inside, I could feel the plan like a heartbeat, steady, deliberate, and growing louder with each passing second. The days after the gala felt like walking on glass, every step careful, every smile measured, every word weighed. That momentum I felt wasn't just a trick of my imagination. It was tangible. People were looking. He was watching. And I, of all people, had learned how to turn observation into opportunity. The question now wasn't whether I could make people see him for who he was. It was whether I could press the right wounds at the right time so the world would look away from him in shame instead of at me in pity. Timing was everything, and timing would decide whether I finished what I'd started or became another person swallowed by the process. I remember the exact morning I decided to raise the stakes. He left for work with a kiss so quick it felt rehearsed, and I watched him go, feeling strangely hollow and sharp at the same time. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the list I'd been building for months spread out like a map. On it were names, dates, events, screenshots, evidence gathered with a patience that felt like cold labor. The screenshot of his message about replacing her with someone slim was still there, folded into a folder labeled timing. The folder felt heavier than any of the physical boxes in our attic. I wanted to use it not as a weapon of petty revenge, but as the key to unseating his crown. The idea of exposing him privately first to the people whose opinions mattered to him kept pulling at me. If his inner circle turned, the rest would follow. So I made a plan to stage the first reveal where it would bite hardest, his family gathering. It was cruel, in a surgical way, because that's where he'd humiliated me first. I didn't want to shout at the table or fling accusations like knives. I wanted something quieter, like a mirror held up slowly until he couldn't avoid his reflection. The family was hosting another dinner. Tradition, gossip, and performative niceties would be there in full bloom. That was my arena. But I couldn't just walk in with a folder and say, look, people get defensive. They turn protectors and remodel reality instantly. So I needed soft arranges, pretext, placement, and witnesses. I called his sister casually one evening, the kind of call that sounded like two siblings catching up. We talked about mundane things, a new cafe downtown, a book she'd liked. Then I steered the conversation toward family dynamics, the way their mother was into appearances, the way the brother loved to joke. I let her speak and listen. And when she mentioned the upcoming dinner, I said, I'd love to bring a photo album from my work. Folks do that sometimes where I volunteer. She liked the idea. It was innocent. It was, crucially, something she would bring up later in the room as if it had been her idea.
I planted other seeds. To the cousin who had confided in me about work stress, I mentioned a documentary I'd been helping with about social perceptions and body image. The cousin, who had his own petty resentments toward the family's hierarchy, perked up and promised to ask his girlfriend to bring up the topic during dinner. I was careful to keep my fingerprints off everything. The more accidental my influences appeared, the more genuine the reactions would seem. The day of the dinner, I dressed in the sort of outfit that suggests you are comfortable owning a room but not trying to command it. I wanted people to drop their guard. When we arrived, laughter bubbled like it always did, easy, anticipatory, practiced. They greeted me with the same half smiles that had become their habit. My husband made some throwaway tease about the dessert table, and someone laughed because that's what they did. Inside, I kept my face even. I refused to look small. After main course and polite complaints about the salad, miraculously, someone, his sister, suggested we share something sentimental she'd found. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a post and began to talk about how social media affects body standards. It was a gentle segue into the territory I'd been nudging. The room shifted from the rote humor to a more reflective cadence, and I saw my opening and took it, like a diver leaping from the highest board. I said, without theatrics, "It's funny how quickly we normalize certain jokes. People think it's harmless." My voice was steady.
Sometimes the person making the joke is the last to see the consequences. It drew a few confused looks, but mostly polite interest. Then I shared, in a calm, reasoned way, a small anecdote about how people's offhand remarks can shape a life. I didn't accuse. I told a story about someone who had been publicly mocked and how it affected her job, friendships, and sleep. I watched the room. Eyes landed on him like a prism catching light. He shifted, and when he tried to dismiss me with a joke, his mother chimed in to echo a laugh. But this time there was a crack. You could see the discomfort like a tiny storm cloud forming in the air between us. The clever part wasn't the anecdote itself. It was the way I layered it with the right people's curiosity and the suggestion that there was something they should perhaps reconsider. It was psychological leverage. The truth does its work slowly when it isn't shoved into a person's face. During dessert, the cousin who'd promised to mention the documentary did exactly that. He talked about a scene in which a family laughed at someone and later regretted it. And then, almost casually, he said, "Don't you think sometimes we miss how hurtful we can be?" It wasn't a direct accusation, but the implication rode through the room. My husband's laughter faltered. His brother made a tight smile. The rest of the family looked back and forth, uncertain where their loyalty lay, with the tradition of jokes or the uncomfortable glow of the conversation. After dinner, as people lingered, someone had the idea to share photos from their phones. It was harmless. Someone else began showing pictures, vacations, babies, silly faces. Then, as if fate had a sense of dramatic timing, his brother handed his phone to someone and said, "Guess who this is?" The image that popped up was from months ago, a screenshot of a private conversation he'd had with a colleague about image and dating choices. A picture of the man smiling at a city rooftop, and underneath an offhand comment about finding someone who actually fits my type. There was a murmur. People squinted. Someone joked nervously, and then stopped because the joke felt thin. The room's laughter had a new note now. Uncertain, like people trying on a new language and not quite finding the right words. The architecture of their comfort was showing cracks. It was like watching a small animal realize a predator is nearby. Panic is slow and internal before it becomes visible. I could see my husband's jaw clench. His eyes darted to me, and for a moment I thought I saw fear. He wasn't used to fear being directed toward him. He was used to issuing it. I didn't shout. I didn't slam. I only said, "People often forget that words have weight." It sounded like a gentle proverb, but everyone in the room knew exactly what I meant. His mother's face, which had been a practiced mesh of concern and superiority, went slack for the first time. She looked at her son, and then at me, like she was trying to measure the gap between the woman she'd once been charmed by and the woman in front of her now. After that night, the atmosphere at home was tense in a way I relished, but also feared. He started to watch his words more often, and his jokes lost that casual venom. The siblings called less frequently, and when they did, the tone was careful, as if they were walking through a room with fragile antiques. That was the small victory. The stakes, however, had ratcheted up. Now that the family had seen a version of the truth, they might close ranks. They might go to war. Revenge is a risk because it invites retaliation. I had to be ready. And retaliation came, but not the way I expected. One evening, my husband left his laptop open and wandered to the balcony for a smoke. Curiosity always remains a human weakness, even for those who pride themselves on ethics. I might have told myself later that I had a right to know, that his previous behaviors justified what I did next. But gratitude or justification doesn't erase the sting of betrayal, for him and for me. I opened his email and found a chain that made my stomach drop. It wasn't just flippant comments, it was a plan. He had been talking with someone about moving cities, about starting afresh with someone who fit a certain image, discussing logistics, apartments, social circles, better matches. It read like a blueprint for replacement. In that moment, something hot and raw rose up inside me. I could have taken that as cause to pack a bag, to leave a note, to walk out and watch him realize the cost. But my months of planning had conditioned me to ask, what would be more devastating, a scene or a slow collapse? The file was another loaded card. I printed it and placed it with the screenshot from months ago, but I still didn't play them. Not publicly. Not yet. Instead, I started to build an unassailable narrative, one that combined proof with social pressure so it couldn't be dismissed as sour grapes. Evidence without context is easy to spin. So I brought in context. I called an old friend who was a journalist in a local lifestyle magazine. Nothing sensational, nothing scandal-driven, but someone with credibility and a sense for stories about social dynamics. I pitched a piece about the changing face of modern marriage, about how appearances seep into family expectations, and the ways couples navigate humiliation. I didn't mention names. I framed it as research and asked if he could suggest a commentator for the piece. He asked if I'd be willing to share my experience anonymously. I said yes, but the more I talked, the more he wanted specifics. Being careful in conversation, I gave him enough to show there was a story, but not enough for him to run with. He agreed to keep in touch. When you're weaving social pressure, credible sources are like long threads you tie into place. Tactically, I kept my cool at home, but ratcheted up the pressure in public. I attended more community events, not to flaunt, but to be present in spaces where his friends and colleagues noticed. A few people started to look at me differently, with respect or curiosity, it was hard to tell, and those glances traveled back to him. He never confronted me directly about any of this. He became more vindictive in subtler ways. Passive-aggressive comments left on Post-its, small but noticeable snubs in front of friends, a withholding of affection that felt punitive. It was lonely. It was the part of the plan I hadn't counted on emotionally. How isolating the slow grind of reclaiming oneself could be. There were moments when I questioned myself. Was I becoming someone else? The woman I watched in the mirror sometimes looked like a reflection of my anger, and I feared losing the humane part of me. I whispered to myself in the dark, remember why you started. The why was clear, not to crush him, but to expose truth and reclaim dignity. I clung to that like a lifeline. Then came the misstep that almost ended everything. I had arranged for a mutual friend to casually mention an anecdote about a man who'd been careless with his partner's reputation, and that friend, eager to be dramatic, took the hint and made the story far more local and specific than I intended. The gossip ricocheted and landed at my mother-in-law's ears the next day with the sting of betrayal added. She called me, voice thin and clipped, asking if I had been stirring up trouble about the family. Her tone implied that I was the malignant force, the woman making waves. For a second, I felt the years of doubt creep back in. Had I miscalculated? Was I the one who would be remembered as the attacker? I answered calmly and denied stirring anything, and then, in a move that surprised even me, I invited her for coffee. I needed to confront the source of her annoyance face to face, to see the human behind the aristocratic airs. At the cafe, over bitter coffee, she looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. I didn't bring evidence or accusations. I brought honesty. I told her how hurtful some comments had been, how public humiliation had seared me, how I had felt alone. She stared. And then I saw something like recognition flicker. It wasn't apology, but it was something. A crack in the wall of her certainty. I didn't need her to change completely. I needed her to feel the weight of what she'd helped normalize. She left the cafe thoughtful, and for the first time, I saw her mention my name without the automatic patronizing tone. Small victories, again. That night, my husband came home late and tried to pretend nothing had changed. He kissed my cheek and said, "You're being dramatic lately." He didn't know, of course, that other people had begun to hold him to account. He didn't know that I had begun to quietly orchestrate a collapse that would be public in its consequences and private in its precision. He only knew his life was getting less comfortable. He only knew he was losing ground. And yet, even as my plans advanced, I held back the final card. Because the true moment of reckoning needs not just proof, but poetic timing. You need to create a space where his own actions do the damage you've been waiting for him to take. That's the line between cheap revenge and transformative justice. I was determined to cross it with dignity intact. So as I closed my laptop and let the house settle into the same familiar night noises, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant siren, I felt both dread and triumph. The slow work was paying off. People were beginning to see. But the part of me that worried about becoming my enemy whispered that the next moves would require care that bordered on cruelty if mishandled. I promised myself that when the time came, I would be merciful in the way I revealed him, truthful, precise, and with a purpose. He turned in early, exhausted from his day of phone calls and meetings. I stared at the ceiling for a long time before sleep finally dragged me under. The plan was ready to be executed. The only question left was whether I had the nerve to pull the trigger when the moment arrived. What would you have done if every person you loved had seen you as a joke? Would you have let them keep laughing, or would you have rewired the world so they had to face the sound of their own cruelty? I clung to that question like a shield and a blade, knowing the next chapter would ask everything of me. The week the plan moved from slow simmer to boil, everything seemed to orbit a single event, a charity auction tied to the company he loved to brag about. He'd spent the last month name-dropping the gala at every opportunity, the guest list, the photographers, the VIP after-party. Of course he had. Visibility was his oxygen. He bragged about being on panels and rubbing elbows with people who mattered. It was the perfect stage. I could feel the electricity of the moment long before the night arrived, a sort of magnetic pull that said, either you step into the light now, or you let him continue to perform his small, cruel theater. I chose the light. In the days leading up to the gala, I did the things I'd rehearsed in silence for months. I let a trusted photographer friend know that I'd be attending and asked if he might have time to take a few candid shots. Nothing staged, just authentic images for a piece I was planning about women reclaiming their presence in corporate spaces. The photographer agreed, intrigued, and the arrangement felt harmless enough to the casual observer. But the camera, as anyone who's ever worked with one knows, is a merciless storyteller. It captures truth without commentary. I intended to let that truth do some of the work. On the night of the auction, I dressed in a way that made people look twice. Not gaudy, not pleading, but quietly unmistakable. The gown hugged the right places and moved in a way that suggested a kind of calm command. I did my makeup like armor. I wore heels I could stand tall in. He stood beside me when we arrived, his hand at my back, his smile the practiced shade of smug. He introduced me to people with that same easy arrogance, the casual half-flirt that made him seem charming to those who didn't notice the knives beneath. I let him perform. That was part of the point. The room thrummed with polite conversation and clinking glasses. I moved through it with the patient predators the confidence I'd honed, listening, letting others talk first, placing a gentle anecdote here and there that made people lean in. The photographer trailed, discreet and competent, catching small moments, the way I tucked hair behind my ear, how I laughed at a joke with my hand to my mouth, how I looked at him when he wasn't watching, and the tiny flicker of something like guilt crossed his face. Those images would later be useful in ways that had nothing to do with vanity. They were context. They were proof that I existed outside the caricature he painted me to be. Then came the auction itself. People bid on items with the noise of generosity, the kind of performative philanthropy that looks good in a column and feels better in a mirror. He was on the stage at one point, microphone in hand, doing the kind of shallow charm he thought made him irresistible. I could feel the resentment in the room like static electricity. Not all of it at me, but some of it directed at the way he performed supremacy. It occurred to me then that the same stage that elevated him could also humble him. The difference between performance and exposure is a single, deliberate act. I had arranged for my journalist friend to be there under the pretext of covering the charity. He had a small press pass and access to backstage. I had also quietly emailed a few people whose respect for him I suspected might be shaken by context. A former colleague with a grudge, a social influencer who had once been mocked by him in a now-deleted story, the cousin who'd already upset the family once. I didn't orchestrate scandal. I created a constellation. People would notice, and once eyes started swiveling the right way, the gravitational pull of truth would intensify. I was giving people permission to see what was already true. The first crack came unexpectedly. After the auction, there was a moment when he stepped off the stage, flushed with applause, and made a beeline for a group of executives. One of them, a woman he'd once publicly slighted at a meeting, now looked him in the face and said with an even, measured voice, "I read a piece recently about how jokes can be weaponized in small cultures." The comment hung in the air like an accusation that slowly crystallized. He laughed nervously and shifted his weight. It was a small thing, but the room registered it. Discomfort is contagious. It spreads, and people begin to fill the silence with their own versions of events. Meanwhile, my photographer took pictures that would not only become part of my portfolio, but also part of an unmistakable narrative. Me, present and engaged. Him, performing and defensive. Those images, paired with the stories I had been careful to seed, began to form a pattern. If you sit with a pattern long enough, it stops seeming like coincidence and starts feeling like design. That's when reputations begin to wobble. Backstage, as people drifted toward the after-party, my journalist friend cornered me and said softly, "If you ever want to go on record, even anonymously, I can help amplify this. It's a larger story than you think." I nodded. He didn't push. He didn't need to. He handed me his card. The card felt like a fuse. Short enough to ignite something, but long enough to give me a choice. It was then that things started happening in ways I hadn't completely controlled. A woman from his company came up to me, her voice low, and said, "I wanted to tell you I'm sorry about some of the things that said." She looked embarrassed and sincere. It was never right. The repentance was small, but real. People who had been passive in the past were beginning to feel uncomfortable in their complicity. That unease is dangerous when you're trying to sustain a false narrative. And then the phone call, the one that blurred strategy into chaos. I had scheduled an accidental meeting where his brother's phone would be in view and the conversation would take place in front of the right crowd. Instead, at the after-party, his brother's ex-girlfriend, in a slack moment of inebriated candidness, stood up and told a story about how his brother used to joke about trading up partners. It was told as gossip, but the ears in the room didn't treat it that way. It was personal. His brother barked a laugh that cracked, and his face flushed a dangerous red. My husband looked like he had been slapped. You could see the shift like tectonic plates moving. Alliances reformed in the room. People who had previously laughed at my expense now pivoted to watch his reaction. For every person who felt pity toward me, there were two who felt curiosity about him. That curiosity can metastasize into scrutiny quickly. As the night wore on, the pressure increased. He became more aggressive in small, careless ways, making cutting comments about people's ambitions, deflected, attempting to reclaim the narrative by attacking others. The strategy of the bully is always to create a new target, and he tried it with the skill of someone who'd practiced his audience well. But in doing so, he exposed fissures in his persona. People who had tolerated his barbs for a laugh were now weighing the cost of association. On our way home, he was quiet. He fumbled through small talk, jokes that used to land now falling flat. I felt the subtle victory, but I also felt the weight of what this was doing to me. Watching someone else fall from a pedestal can be intoxicating and nauseating at the same time. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The night's adrenaline made my mind race through every possible fallout. Would he retaliate? Would he double down and smear me? I had prepped for these scenarios. The lawyer friend, the journalist who could corroborate, the screenshots safely stored. But at the core of it all, there was fear. The kind that makes your mouth dry and your heart beat like an animal's. Over the next week, whispers began to ripple outward. A message here, a hushed comment there. Social media is an unpredictable beast. You can feed it carefully, or it can be fed by accident. Someone in his circle, tired of holding the weight of awkwardness, started a thread critiquing certain behaviors in professional settings, and it wasn't long before the discussion looped back to him. People who had been silent found the courage to talk. The momentum was no longer solely mine. It had become collective. At home, the atmosphere changed from icy to combustible. He was meaner in private now, perhaps recognizing that if he could publicly humiliate, he could also privately punish. He would leave barbed notes in places I'd find them, or make thinly veiled comments when friends were around. Sometimes he would turn the pity of others into a weapon against me, saying things like, "You're making a scene," as if reclaiming dignity was the problem. The cruelty tightened like a vice. I won't lie. Some nights I cried quietly, exhausted by the emotional labor of war. But then came the moment that would open the final door. It was something elegant in its simplicity. His own hubris. He thought himself above the patterns of consequence. He thought he could compartmentalize his cruelty. He was wrong. He made a mistake that was small in its conception and enormous in its consequences. At a weekend brunch, confident in the security of his chosen image, he made an offhand comment, loud enough for a few new acquaintances to hear, about finding the right type and how people should know their place. The room tightened. One of the women he addressed, a consultant who'd recently been promoted after speaking out against similar office behavior, didn't let it slide. She leaned in and asked, with the clarity of someone who'd heard this tone 1,000 times, "Do you think making people smaller makes you bigger?" The question hit like a bell. He stammered. He tried to laugh it off. He turned on charm. But charm is brittle when used as armor for shame. Within 48 hours, the post went up. Not mine. Not entirely. Someone at that brunch, fed up with normalizing small cruelties, had decided it was time to speak publicly. They wrote about the culture of casual cruelty in certain social circles, about the way offhand comments chip away at dignity. They didn't name names, but the photos from the gala and the details were enough for people who were paying attention to connect the dots. The journalist friend shared a link on his private timeline with a comment, "This is part of a larger issue. If anyone wants to talk, I'm gathering voices." The ripple became a wave. And suddenly, the world that had once applauded my husband's jokes now had the option to step back and look at them with a new lens. Past jokes were excavated and looked at for what they were. Stories floated to the surface like buoyant secrets freed from the pressure of silence. His colleagues began to distance themselves, not always in loud denunciations, but in polite leaves of absence from his social orbit. He called me furious, whispering threats masked as pleas. He accused me of orchestrating a campaign. I listened. I let him talk. I let him think he had power. He tried to lash back. He circulated a version of events in which I was the aggressor, the eccentric wife with a vendetta. He showed selective messages to mutual friends, twisted context into plausible lies. But the structure I'd built, evidence, witnesses, people who'd quietly observed and were now willing to speak, was stronger than his improvisation. The public began to triangulate. Patterns don't lie as easily as people do. One night, after a particularly nasty call, he left the house for a while. I found his laptop open on the kitchen table, tabs he'd left running with draft messages, heated exchanges, and half-written apologies that would never be sent. I took a deep breath and closed it. I thought about exposing everything in a dramatic act that would flatten him in a single blow. But I didn't. I chose again to be strategic. I turned to my map of contacts, to the journalists and friends who'd been watching, and to the quiet people who had begun to find courage. The collapse would be a slow, undeniable unspooling, not a scream in the night. Over the next month, reputations shifted. People who had built their identities on sitting comfortably beside him started to feel the awkwardness of association. Invitations that once flowed to his inbox dried up. A sponsor he'd been courting silently backed out after conversations I didn't even know about. The house of cards cracked in droplets rather than in a single violent gust. Watching it was not wholly satisfying. It was complicated, painful, and strangely lonely. It's one thing to see justice as an abstract ideal, and another to watch a human being who was once intimate with you unravel. I felt compassion, even as I felt vindication. That duality is an odd human ache. And then, finally, the phone call that sounded like an ending arrived. One of his closest professional allies, someone he'd always trusted to smooth over rough patches, called and said, quietly, that they needed to talk in person. He met them in a cafe 3 days later and returned home pale and small. He didn't mention what was said, but the next morning he packed a single suitcase and told me he needed space. He insisted it wasn't about us, that he needed time to think. He left a note that read like a confession couched in pride, apologetic but not fully owning. That morning, the house was quiet in a way that wasn't merely absence. It was the sound of something shifting permanently. When the door closed behind him, I felt a strange, dissonant peace. Part of me wanted to gloat, to revel in the payback. Instead, I found myself sitting on the couch and letting the silence fill the room, like a new, cleaner air. He had been displaced not by a single theatrical reveal, but by a collective reexamination of what had been accepted for too long. I had been the instrument, carefully used, but the instrument only sang because others finally listened. What would you have done? Would you have wanted him to leave with the dignity of an exit? Or would you have wanted him to be forced to confront himself? I'll admit, I wanted both. Accountability without cruelty. In the end, the outcome was messy and human. He left. He was not ruined in the tabloid sense, but he was unmoored. He could no longer coast on the image he'd built. And in the empty spaces he left behind, I began, tentatively, to breathe again.
The day after he left, I woke up expecting to hear his footsteps, his voice, his familiar ritual of criticism disguised as casual remarks. Instead, there was silence. A silence so thick, it felt like a blanket. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring out the window, and for the first time in years, I felt something that had been absent. Space. Space to breathe, to exist without being the butt of someone's joke. Space to feel the weight lift from my chest, little by little. But don't misunderstand me. This wasn't some Hollywood ending where I danced in the sunshine, instantly healed. No, healing doesn't work like that. The truth is, I cried. A lot. I cried because I mourned the years I had lost to his cruelty. Because I realized how much I had shrunk myself to fit his vision of who I should be. I cried because, deep down, there was still a part of me that remembered the man I thought he was when we first met, and letting go of that illusion hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. The revenge had been necessary. It was the fire that burned away the rot. But what came after was harder. The rebuilding. You spend so long consumed by survival and retaliation that when it's over, you're left staring at the ruins, wondering, who am I without this battle? For weeks, I avoided his family. Not that they reached out much. The same people who laughed so loud at the dinner table suddenly had nothing to say. The silence from their end was almost comical, like children caught misbehaving and too ashamed to admit it. I didn't need their apologies. Their absence was apology enough. Every time I thought back to their smirks and snickers, I reminded myself they were accomplices. They had enabled his cruelty. They had let me bleed while they clapped. They weren't worth my grief. But I'll tell you something. I did run into his brother once, months later. It was at the grocery store, of all places. He avoided eye contact, shifted uncomfortably, and mumbled a half-hearted, "Hope you're doing well." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is silence, and watching him squirm under the weight of it was more satisfying than any words I could have spoken. As for him, my husband, my former husband, I heard through the grapevine that he tried to rebuild elsewhere. New job, new friends, new image. But it never stuck. People talk. Stories linger. Reputation follows you like a shadow. And no matter how fast you run, it's always there, reminding you of who you really are. He became quieter, less bold, almost diminished. The world stopped laughing with him, and without that audience, he was just a man standing alone with his cruelty. And me? I grew. Slowly, awkwardly at first, but steadily. I took up running, not to lose weight or fit anyone's mold, but because I liked the way my lungs burned with life. I started cooking meals for myself without the fear of someone mocking my portions. I bought clothes that made me feel powerful. I even started dating again, cautiously, with my boundaries sharp and my voice unshakable. You know what the real revenge was? It wasn't the whispers or the downfall or the humiliation that circled back to him. No, the real revenge was my peace.
my freedom. The fact that I could wake up each morning and know that I was no longer tethered to a man who thrived on belittling me. That I could laugh again, not at someone else's expense, but with pure, unfiltered joy. Sometimes I think back to that dinner table, the food, the wine, the clatter of cutlery, and then that awful, echoing laughter. I imagine the woman I was, sitting there shrinking into herself, cheeks burning, eyes wet. If I could reach through time and touch her shoulder, I'd whisper, "You won't be here forever." They don't get the final word. You do. So let me ask you, listening to this, what would you have done? Would you have walked away quietly, cutting your losses? Or would you have stayed long enough to show them that the woman they mocked had more power than they ever dreamed? Be honest. Would you have waited as long as I did for payback? Or would you have struck sooner? Because here's what I've learned. Revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about reclamation. Taking back your story, your dignity, your life. He tried to make me into a punchline, but in the end, I was the one holding the pen. And maybe that's the lesson for anyone who's ever been laughed at, belittled, or dismissed. You don't have to stay small. You don't have to swallow their cruelty and let it define you. You can choose when and how to rise. And sometimes the sweetest revenge is not just watching them fall, but rising so high they can no longer reach you. So yes, he made fun of my body, he mocked me in front of his family, he thought I would break under the weight of his words. But instead, I turned those words into weapons, sharper than anything he could have imagined. And in the end, I didn't just win the battle, I reclaimed myself. And that, more than anything else, is the kind of ending that doesn't fade.